here. I need your papers, now.
Excuse me? I'm a U.S. citizen. I work here. I don't understand.
Don't play games. Show me some ID. Now, where's it at?
I just opened the pharmacy. I've done nothing wrong. Can you explain why?
Explain? You don't get to explain. I ask you comply. Papers, now.
I'm standing in my own business.
It was a bright, sunlit morning in Los Angeles, but the air felt heavy with tension. Outside her pharmacy, Dr. Monique Carter, a black woman and respected healthcare professional, was pulled from the rhythm of her day by an unexpected confrontation. A uniformed officer, authority gleaming from his badge, demanded her identification not as a routine check, but as a question of her belonging in the country she was born in. The camera of a nearby security system captured every startled glance, every sharp intake of breath, and the weight of injustice in real time. Watch closely, because this isn't just a story of one woman's fight, it's a mirror, reflecting systemic bias, the fragility of trust, and the law's promise. Witness courage, legal reckoning, and the enduring question, what does just truly look like? The morning in Los Angeles unfolded like any other. The sunlight poured through the wide glass windows of Monique Carter's pharmacy, painting the linoleum floors in shades of gold. The faint hum of traffic on the boulevard mixed with the distant wail of a siren, ordinary city sounds that never seemed threatening. Inside, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the antiseptic smell of prescription medications, a quiet promise of routine and care. Dr. Carter moved with practiced precision, arranging pill bottles, scanning labels, greeting the occasional early customer with a polite smile. Everything was ordinary, measured, predictable, and then it wasn't. Through the wide plate glass doors, a uniformed Los Angeles police officer appeared, his presence sudden and deliberate. There was no preamble, no casual greeting. His gaze fixed on her, a weight pressing down as if the very air had changed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clipped, edged with authority, "I need to see your papers." The words, ordinary in some contexts, landed like stones. Papers, as if she were an outsider in the country where she had been born, where she had lived her entire life. Dr. Carter froze. Her hand, poised over the counter, trembled slightly. The customers stopped mid-step, their eyes flicking between the officer and the pharmacist as though holding their breath in collective disbelief. Outside, the morning carried on, oblivious, the sun climbing higher in the clear blue sky, unaware of the confrontation unfolding on the asphalt. A security camera mounted high above the entrance captured every detail: the officer's stiff stance, the tension in his jaw, the sharp movements of his hand near his radio. It recorded her initial hesitation, the way her eyes darted toward the door, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she tried to steady herself. Every second stretched into an eternity. "Your identification." "Now," the officer repeated, voice firmer, almost mechanical. He was trained, clearly, in assertive engagement protocols used for what the department defined as potential identity verification. But here, the procedure collided with reality. Dr. Carter was calm, precise, and fully within her rights, but the imbalance of power, the assumption encoded into the very interaction, made her words feel small. "I'm a U.S. citizen," she said, measured, but the officer's gaze didn't waver. There was no recognition, no allowance for nuance, only the rigid rules he had internalized in training. She could cite law, policy, even internal LAPD guidelines that outlined the limit of stop and identify encounters, but it didn't soften the force of the moment. Outside, a passerby paused. Phone raised to capture what they instinctively understood as wrong, as unjust. The silence around them broken only by distant traffic and the occasional shout of a street vendor heightened the tension. In slow motion, every gesture became magnified. Dr. Carter's hand brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the officer shifting his weight, the subtle exchange of glances between two bystanders who hadn't asked to witness this but couldn't look away. She felt a mix of disbelief and moral outrage. The absurdity of the request cut deep, a personal affront layered over the systemic reality it represented. Each second was saturated with meaning, the legacy of profiling, the unspoken hierarchy of power, the fragile line between authority and overreach. Finally, she reached into her purse not for documents but for composure. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself in law and logic. She knew the rules. Officers may request identification and under specific circumstances, but her citizenship was not in question. Her right to refuse an unlawful demand was clear, yet confronting it carried its own danger. The officer's training, his sense of authority, his assumption of control, they collided with her own dignity and intelligence in a tense standoff that the camera recorded with cold, unflinching accuracy. The confrontation ended without physical harm, but its impact rippled outward. Dr. Carter's morning routine, the comforting hum of the pharmacy, the simple act of being in her own neighborhood, all were irrevocably altered. Behind the lens of the security camera, the tension, fear, and mortal outrage were frozen in time. A visceral reminder of the fragility of belonging and the weight of systemic bias. By mid-morning, the first whispers of the incident began circulating, a subtle vibration of collective awareness that would soon escalate into legal action, public scrutiny, and a confrontation with the very systems designed to protect. In the heart of Los Angeles, a simple morning had been transformed into the beginning of a story about power, identity, and justice. Every glance, every gesture, every word captured the imbalance of authority and the enduring strength of one woman standing her ground. The day that started with ordinary sunlight ended with the weight of an extraordinary moment, setting the stage for a journey that would test courage, law, and the meaning of justice itself. The confrontation lingered in the air like smoke, invisible, yet suffocating. Dr. Monique Carter returned to the quiet of her pharmacy, but the morning sunlight no longer felt warm. Every surface, every familiar scent, the antiseptic of the countertops, the faint aroma of coffee, seemed to hum with residual tension. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for a prescription bottle, a tremor she attributed not to fatigue, but to the memory of the officer, as clipped commands, and the assumption that she did not belong in her own city, her own country. The security footage, still blinking silently on the screen behind the counter, replayed each second with unforgiving clarity, capturing every micro-expression, every pause, every flicker of moral outrage that had passed across her face. The first step, she knew, was understanding her rights. What could she do? Where did the law protect her? And where was it silent? Dr. Carter spent hours that afternoon scanning federal and state regulations, reading through the Los Angeles Police Department's protocols regarding stop and identify encounters. Officers are permitted to request identification under specific circumstances, but a random demand in front of a business, on the basis of assumptions about citizenship, violated both policy and common sense. The legal language was meticulous, precise, almost clinical, yet it mirrored the human frustration she felt, the gap between written justice and lived experience. Even as she absorbed the words of law, she began collecting evidence. She cataloged every frame of the security footage, noting timestamps, gestures, and interactions. She reached out to witnesses: the barista across the street, the pedestrian who had paused mid-step, the customer who had left the store in confusion. Each person contributed a fragment, a perspective that together formed a mosaic of truth, corroborating the simple fact: she had been singled out, questioned, and intimidated without cause. The calls to civil rights attorneys began in the late afternoon there, voices calm yet urgent on the other end of the line. They asked questions she had never considered: procedural precedent, officer training records, prior complaints, municipal liability. She listened, absorbing every word, and for the first time felt the breadth of the legal machinery she would have to navigate. The process was both daunting and meticulous, a dance between law, policy, and human narrative. Days blurred into nights. Her home, once a place of rest, became an office, a quiet war room. Emails poured in, court forms, depositions, strategy outlines, and she responded with a precision born of necessity. Sleep became fragmented, punctuated by dreams of the officer's uniform and the lingering echo of his demand. Questions from her family, simple yet piercing, reminded her of the human cost. Are you going to be okay? Do you really think this will matter? She had no immediate answers, only a conviction that justice, however delayed, must be pursued. Interactions with her legal team revealed more than procedural intricacies. They revealed the emotional landscape of navigating systemic bias. One attorney, a quiet woman with years of civil rights litigation behind her, leaned back in her chair and said, "Cases like this are about more than money. They were about setting a precedent, showing the system that authority has limits." Another, a younger associate, whispered over coffee, "She is strong, but even strong people feel small when bureaucracy and bias collide." The team's words underscored the paradox. The fight was both personal and universal, a singular experience that mirrored countless others who had been marginalized, overlooked, or profiled. Every document filed, every call made, every witness prepared was a step deeper into the labyrinth of systemic accountability. The legal landscape was intricate. Municipal codes intersected with federal civil rights protections, and past case law wove through the narrative like an invisible current. Precedent mattered: who had challenged the LAPD before, under what circumstances, and with what outcomes. Yet procedural knowledge alone was insufficient. The emotional toll was real, pressing and constant. Dr. Carter felt it in her shoulders, her sleep, the tension that refused to dissipate from her jaw. Outside, Los Angeles carried on. Streets bustled, traffic flowed, and the sun climbed higher each day. But for Dr. Carter, time had a different rhythm. Every moment was a negotiation between fear and courage, frustration and resolve. She had become, without choice, the center of a legal storm, and the weight of that center pressed down not only on her body, but on her sense of identity and belonging. It was an awakening. The personal stakes were clear, but so too were the societal ones. By the end of the first week, the contours of a courtroom showdown began to emerge. Strategy meetings outlined potential outcomes, but also ethical dilemmas: how to balance the need for justice with the need to maintain composure, how to translate personal trauma into procedural clarity, how to transform fear into evidence. Each day brought new challenges, but also a growing sense of agency. Dr. Carter realized that the confrontation, which had initially seemed an isolated injustice, was now a lens through which broader patterns of bias, authority, and accountability could be exposed. Even in the quiet moments sitting alone at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, reviewing deposition notes, she felt the weight of both responsibility and potential impact. This was no longer simply about one morning, one officer, one demand for papers. It was about the interplay between systemic authority and human dignity, the tension between procedural correctness and moral fairness. The awakening was not just legal, it was personal, emotional, and profoundly reflective. By the time she returned to the pharmacy the following week, Dr. Carter was no longer the woman who had merely opened the doors to her business that morning. She carried with her the knowledge that her fight, though taxing and complex, was necessary. It would set the stage not just for her own vindication, but for a broader conversation about accountability, the limits of authority, and the meaning of justice in a city that prided itself on diversity yet struggled with implicit bias. The courtroom would be the next chapter, but the foundation, the evidence, the resolve, the emotional clarity had already been laid. The morning had been stolen, the routine disrupted, but in its place arose awareness, a legal awakening intertwined with moral purpose. Los Angeles, in all its sprawling complexity, was watching, and Dr. Carter was ready to face the storm. The courtroom doors groaned open, a sound amplified by the hushed tension in the room. Dr. Monique Carter stepped inside, the polished wood and high ceilings casting long shadows over the marble floor. The scent of legal leather and ink mingled with the faint, recycled air of the municipal building, carrying with it an unspoken weight. Here, the law would speak, but not necessarily with fairness. She felt the gravity of the moment in her chest, a pressure that made her heart beat in slow, measured increments, as if time itself had thickened. Every detail seemed magnified. Her hands, clenched around the edge of the defense table, trembled slightly, not with fear but with anticipation. The camera of memory captured the subtle tightening of her jaw, the involuntary shift of her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned the faces of officers, attorneys, and court clerks. She was acutely aware of the procedural choreography around her, the judge's gavel, the stenographer's rhythmic tapping, the officer's rigid posture. Every movement was part of an intricate dance of authority and accountability. The case unfolded like a mosaic, each piece precise yet fraught with implication. Witness testimony was first. A neighbor who had glimpsed the confrontation from across the street spoke carefully about the officer's approach and the apparent assumption that Dr. Carter's presence in her own neighborhood required verification. Another witness, the barista from a nearby cafe, recounted the stunned silence that had overtaken the street. Their words, interlaced with long pauses and moments of uncertainty, revealed the subtle yet pervasive impact of bias, how even ordinary citizens could become silent observers of injustice, complicit in the way their attention was drawn to an event that should never have occurred. Then came the officer's deposition. His voice, firm yet rehearsed, repeated the language of procedure. "I was following protocol. I requested identification in accordance with LAPD guidelines." The words were precise, but the subtext was palpable. He did not consider her perspective, the weight of her daily life, or the reality of her citizenship. Each response, each carefully measured sentence, exposed the mechanical distance between authority and empathy, the unexamined assumptions that allowed profiling to take root. The security footage played on a large screen, pixel by pixel, frame by frame. Dr. Carter's movements, her hesitant steps, the subtle tremor of her hand were illuminated in stark clarity. The jury could see the tension that had been captured in a cold, impartial lens, a lens that revealed truth without interpretation, leaving human judgment to fill in the moral gap. The juxtaposition of footage and testimony heightened the drama, her calm persistence against the rigid force of an institutionalized procedure. Cinematic framing became unavoidable. The judge's gaze swept over the room in a slow pan, registering both protocol and subtle unease. Close-ups captured the tightening of her attorney's hands as they prepared cross-examination questions. Long shots depicted the courtroom as formal geometry, rows of seats, high wooden paneling, and the elevated bench where law met society. Expectation of justice. Every camera angle of the mind, every imagined shot, reflected the collision between personal narrative and systemic authority. The psychological interplay was as tangible as the legal one. Authority met guilt, assumption met integrity. Dr. Carter's presence challenged the unspoken biases entrenched in the system. Each interaction, the clipped tone of the officer, the measured inquiries of the judge, the careful phrasing of legal counsel was a test of power, morality, and societal expectation. The courtroom became a stage where law and lived experience collided, sometimes harmoniously, often violently. Outside the room, Los Angeles carried on, oblivious to the microcosm of accountability unfolding within the courthouse walls. But inside, every second counted. The stakes were both personal and societal. How the law interpreted her experience could set a precedent not just for her, but for the countless others whose lives were shaped by authority wielded without reflection. As the day wore on, hours blurred into procedural rhythm, objections, recesses, depositions, and the careful threading of evidence into a coherent narrative. The weight of systemic oversight pressed down on everyone present, manifesting in subtle gestures, the officer's shifting gaze, a jury member's momentary frown, the sighs of the court clerk. Dr. Carter absorbed it all, her focus unbroken, yet internally, she felt the tension coil tighter with each passing moment. The chapter drew to its precipice with the judge preparing to recess before final deliberation. The air was thick with anticipation. Every observer understood that a decision hung in balance, poised between recognition of injustice and the inertia of procedural habit. Dr. Carter's hands remained clenched on the table, a quiet emblem of endurance, her gaze steady despite the storm of uncertainty that raged both within and around her. The system had been confronted, but its verdict was not yet known. She left the courtroom briefly, stepping into a hallway where light poured through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the air. For a moment, she breathed deeply, allowing herself to feel the enormity of what had transpired, the collision of law, bias, and personal courage. Yet even in this pause, she understood that the fight was far from over. The tension would return, thick and palpable, with the judge's ruling still pending. In that space, she reflected on the nature of authority, how it could protect but also intimidate, how procedures, when untempered by conscience, could become instruments of oppression. Every interaction had been a test of endurance, every legal maneuver a reflection of broader societal assumptions. By the time she returned to the courtroom, the story was no longer just about her morning encounter. It had become a meditation on the fragility of justice, the persistence of bias, and the courage required to face it head-on. The audience is left with the mounting tension of a system poised to either acknowledge the injustice she endured or reaffirm the very biases it was meant to check. The stage is set, the moral stakes high, and the cinematic tableau every hand, glance, and pause lingers, demanding reflection before the next chapter unfolds. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that presses into your chest and makes every heartbeat sound like a drum in an empty hall. Dr. Monique Carter sat at the front row of the plaintiff's table, finger laced, eyes fixed on the judge as he cleared his throat and began to speak. The words were precise, deliberate, measured, but their weight struck like thunder. $15.9 million. The sum was staggering, a material acknowledgement of the harm inflicted. Yet it felt almost secondary to the moral clarity the ruling conveyed. Relief washed over her in waves she hadn't anticipated. Her shoulders sagged, a quiet surrender to the intensity of months of stress and fear, the tremor that had first gripped her. Hands that fateful morning returned, this time with the relief of vindication. Tears prickled the edges of her eyes unbidden, as she allowed herself to finally exhale. Around her, the courtroom reacted differently. The media scuttled quietly to record notes. The defense attorneys exchanged stoic glances, and the judge's own eyes betrayed the gravity of the moment he had just formalized. Outside the courthouse, Los Angeles had begun to stir with awareness. Reporters captured every reaction. Dr. Carter emerging from the doors, flanked by her attorneys, her expression a study in calm dignity. The cityscape framed her. Palm trees swayed in a gentle breeze, sunlight glinting off skyscrapers. Yet beneath the beauty of the morning lay the tremor of reckoning. Headlines spread rapidly. A black woman had challenged authority, faced systemic bias, and emerged victorious. The narrative was not just personal, it was public, a reflection of accountability in motion. The ripple effects were immediate. Within the Los Angeles Police Department, internal reviews began quietly. Memos circulated, and supervisors convened to examine procedures that had allowed the incident to occur. Policy analysts debated revisions to training programs, while civil rights organizations seized the moment to amplify broader conversations about profiling, authority, and oversight. Dr. Carter's victory became a lens through which the public could examine both the failures and potential for reform in law enforcement practices. But even as celebration swelled, the story remained complex. The trauma she had endured, the fear, humiliation, and sense of violation did not vanish with a verdict. Late nights at the pharmacy were still marked by moments of hyper-awareness. The smallest noise outside a window could bring her mind back to the morning the officer approached. Monetary compensation could never fully erase the memory of being questioned as if she were an outsider in her own city. Cinematic close-ups capture these small, private moments, a hand resting on a countertop, a paused breath, the distant hum of traffic outside her window, echoes of a trauma transformed but not erased. Her legal team celebrated quietly, their own relief mingled with professional pride. This is a victory for her, but also for the system, one attorney noted. Eyes lingering on the courthouse doors where history had just been made. It shows that even institutions built for authority can be held accountable. Another remarked on the subtle victories beyond the financial acknowledgement, vindication, and the symbolic correction of injustice long embedded in assumptions and procedural rigidity. Media coverage documented the layers of triumph. Interviews, reenactments, and real-life footage interwove seamlessly, highlighting the stakes of the case. The camera lingered on Dr. Carter's composed demeanor, contrasting it with shots of officers reviewing protocols in a sterile briefing room, journalists analyzing transcripts, and community leaders discussing broader implications. The narrative emphasized that justice is never linear. It does not exist as a single event, but as a process that includes acknowledgement, reflection, and the opportunity for systemic learning. Even the monetary award carried symbolic weight. $15.9 million was more than compensation, it was a public statement. Each dollar represented months of legal strategy, emotional endurance, and the assertion that systemic bias carries real consequences. Yet, the camera captured her most significant victory in quieter moments. The first day back at her pharmacy without fear, helping a patient with calm confidence, the steady rhythm of her work, reclaiming the spaces where her life had been momentarily interrupted. These victories, subtle and human, resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. As the sun began to set over Los Angeles, its light scattering across the city, Dr. Carter walked home slowly, aware of the attention yet grounded in her own rhythm. The case had changed her, of course, but it had also clarified something essential. Justice, even when delayed, can be real, tangible, and transformative. Yet it remained a reminder that systemic change is incremental, that policy reforms, procedural tweaks, and public scrutiny must continue. The story of her morning confrontation had become a symbol, a narrative of both triumph and reflection, a call to vigilance against bias in all its subtle forms. By the chapter's end, the audience witnesses more than a courtroom victory. They experience the nuanced reality of justice. Celebration and reflection coexist. Acknowledgement of harm meets the hope for reform. Dr. Carter's journey demonstrates that victory is not simply a number or a ruling. It is the reclamation of dignity, the assertion of rights, and the subtle, enduring reminder that courage can confront even entrenched authority. The streets of Los Angeles were quieter that morning, almost reverent, as if the city itself had taken a deep breath. Dr. Monique Carter walked past palm trees, swaying lazily against the soft glow of dawn, her steps deliberate, measured. The pharmacy loomed behind her, a place once ordinary now imbued with layers of meaning, a sanctuary, a battleground, a testament to resilience. Inside, shelves of meticulously arranged medications reflected more than care. They reflected endurance, the return to normalcy, and the reclaiming of space after intrusion. She paused, tracing a finger over the counter, thinking back to that first morning when authority had assumed power over her presence in her own neighborhood. The memory was vivid, a phantom weight pressing briefly on her shoulders. Yet today, there was perspective, clarity, and reflection. The journey had revealed fractures not just in the system, but in society's understanding of belonging. The policies that allowed profiling, the assumptions embedded in routine authority, the subtle biases woven into everyday interaction all had collided with her life, demanding acknowledgement. Experts in law and civil rights spoke with measured candor on television panels and in op-eds. Legal analysts unpacked LAPD training manuals, citing the subtle gaps in procedural oversight that had permitted the officer to question Dr. Carter without cause. One expert remarked, "This case isn't just about one individual. It's a lens on structural patterns, the assumptions baked into institutions that rarely get tested." Sociologists spoke of the social weight of authority, the cognitive biases that allow profiling to persist even among well-intentioned personnel, and the human cost of living under such scrutiny. Their words echoed in Dr. Carter's mind as she reviewed letters of support from the public, activists, and community members. The monetary judgment was significant, but its meaning extended beyond figures. It was a tangible acknowledgement that harm matters, that bias carries consequences, that systemic failures must be visible. Yet, the quiet victories every day she spent tending her pharmacy without fear, every respectful interaction with a customer, every reclaimed moment of autonomy were the ones that defined her life. The camera of imagination lingers on these moments, a hand carefully placing pills into a bottle, the soft smile shared with a patient, the steady hum of fluorescent lights over polished countertops. Here, in routine, justice feels lived and personal. Policy reform began in parallel. The department revised identification protocols, introduced mandatory bias awareness workshops, and increased oversight for civilian encounters. Officers in training were observed more carefully, guided to understand that authority must be tempered with empathy and legality. Yet Dr. Carter knew that one case could not eradicate systemic bias. It could illuminate, disrupt, and inspire, but vigilance would always be required. Cinematic sequences capture fleeting glances of officers in training, movements practiced under supervision, mirrors of authority learning to recognize its own limits. Public discourse shifted subtly but perceptibly. Conversations that once skirted around race, belonging, and authority began to surface more openly in neighborhoods, media, and classrooms. The story of a pharmacist in Los Angeles confronting profiling became a reference point, a cautionary tale, and a source of reflection. Panels, workshops, and community forums invited both victims and enforcers to consider the human impact of assumptions and the importance of procedural accountability. In quiet moments, Dr. Carter read messages of solidarity and understanding from strangers, each one a reminder that the personal struggle had catalyzed a broader awakening. Yet the reflection was never naive. Dr. Carter acknowledged that trauma lingers in ways that law cannot always repair. Nights remained punctuated by recollection. The first officer's clipped words could still echo unexpectedly, a reminder of human fragility under authority. But alongside vulnerability grew resilience. She had faced a system, engaged its mechanisms, and emerged with both dignity and agency. The moral of the journey was subtle, but unambiguous. Justice is not merely a verdict. It is the restoration of autonomy, the assertion of rights, and the illumination of systemic weakness. The cinematic lens of her life captured contrasts. Bustling city streets contrasted with the calm of her pharmacy, sunlight glinting off police badges reflected against quiet internal moments of reflection. Each scene reinforced the central tension of her journey. Authority versus human dignity, procedure versus morality, public power versus private vulnerability. In the interplay of these images, the narrative revealed its ultimate truth. Change is neither immediate nor absolute, but it is real, measurable in both policy and personal recovery. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Los Angeles, Dr. Carter lingered by the pharmacy window. Her reflection merged with the street beyond the familiar, ordinary city that had witnessed extraordinary events. She thought of the officer, the courtroom, the legal team, and the community, of the fear and anger, the struggle and vindication. And she understood deeply that the story did not end with a verdict. It continued in every conversation about authority, in every cautious but deliberate step toward reform, in every small act of assertion that reminded the world that belonging is not optional, and dignity is not negotiable. The final frame, imagined or captured, held her standing quietly behind the pharmacy counter, light spilling across her face, eyes steady, hands unclenched. Around her, Los Angeles continued complex, imperfect, alive. The human cost of injustice remained visible, but so did resilience, courage, and the slow, necessary work of reform. The audience is left not only with a sense of resolution, but with reflection, a meditation on authority, bias, justice, and the enduring power of one individual to illuminate the systemic, to challenge assumptions, and to inspire change.